Hi, welcome to Peak Moment. I'm Janaea Donaldson. We've been talking about this being a peak moment in terms of energy decline, but it's bigger than that. It's a peak moment on the planet. We'll be talking about that with my guest, but first, let's have the news with Rick.
Thanks, Janaea. Before we start the news today, a sad reminder that last Wednesday marked the 20th anniversary of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster. It is estimated that close to 100,000 people will have died due to the radioactive effects of that event over time. As the energy crisis of declining fossil fuels is now upon us, it's not surprising that some see nuclear power as a solution for both power production and one solution for our energy needs that is said to avoid the creation of greenhouse gases that cause global warming. While it's true that the power generated produces no direct greenhouse gases, the process of mining uranium, building nuclear facilities along with all associated transportation activities does produce significant amounts of greenhouse gases. Considering those impacts, in addition to the serious problems of toxic radioactive waste disposal and questionable economic benefits, it would be prudent to avoid building any new nuclear power plants without serious consideration of the very devastating consequences to our health, safety, and the environment. Speaking of global warming, or climate change, as you prefer, we turn our attention to that issue today. Our emphasis in the past has been primarily towards peak oil, its dire economic consequences, and what we as individuals and communities can do to mitigate its effects. Some involved in seeking peak oil solutions see the consequences of having less fossil fuels available as beneficial for helping resolve greenhouse gas emissions, and that will certainly be true over time. The dark side of this is that our current administration and many governments and members of the energy industry are embracing and promoting increased use of coal and investigating the extraction of natural gas from methane hydrates. The highly accelerated use of these energy resources could dramatically increase the release of additional sources of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and thus actually make global warming worse rather instead of better. Before we get to the details of climate change, let's start with a little background first. Our planet and its atmosphere has been evolving for billions of years. At this point in its history, we have the luxury of being in a relative state of homeostasis, which is just a big word for things being pretty much in balance, at least until humans started cultivating food and our population grew with the discovery of fossil fuels and industrialization. Certainly, our planet has gone through numerous periods of climate change before us. There were times of intense volcanic activity and clearly recorded ice ages and warming periods. It was some of those warming periods that are thought to be the source of our crude oil and natural gas resources. Eventually, our atmosphere settled down to a balance close to what we have today. Our air is mostly nitrogen and about 21% oxygen, with traces of other gases that make up only about 1%, and it's those that are at issue today. The name greenhouse gas comes from the effect of trapping warmth from the sun, just as a glass-enclosed greenhouse does, or a well-designed passive solar home with lots of glass. We need some greenhouse gases to keep the planet warm and livable. Without them, our planet would average about 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and nothing could live here. Of course, too much of a good thing is usually bad, and with greenhouse gases, it can be very bad. The International Panel on Climate Change, sponsored by the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations, has stated in their findings that there is a discernible human influence on climate, that human activities are clearly responsible for some degree of climate change. I'll continue more on climate change next time, so now back to Janaea and her guest.
Thanks, Rick. My guest today is looking at it from that planetary point of view. This is Gary Gardner from Worldwatch Institute. Who's watching the world? Director of Research. What does Worldwatch do?
Well, we're a non-governmental organization in Washington, D.C. that looks at global trends of all different kinds, environmental, social, economic, and does research on those trends and produces various publications. Probably the best known one is the State of the World report that comes out every year.
And so in the State of the World report, it's not unlike our State of the Union, right? You're looking at all of those areas. How long have you been doing that?
I've been there for 12 years and have contributed to State of the World every year.
So what's happened in the last 12 years? What is happening in the State of the World?
Well, to sum it up, I think there's two major trends we could talk about. One is that most of the environmental trends that we follow, whether it's species loss or climate change or overdrafted wells, groundwater supplies, for example, all of those trends are getting worse. On the other hand, I find some hope in the fact that awareness of these issues continues to rise. So that it feels as though the public is becoming more and more, I think, educated about many of these issues and perhaps getting to a point where they're ready to act.
Are you seeing, you know, when we take a look at sort of, it's like a physician watching the temperature and the, you know, doing the physical on the planet, and you're seeing depletions and fishing out and so on. We're kind of using it up. Is that a way to look at that?
Yeah, I think that's probably a good way to sum it up in just a couple of words. I mean, whether we're talking about carbon emissions into the atmosphere, whether we're talking about the numbers of species that are going extinct, whether we talk about forested area that is being logged, whether we talk about the number of people who are living in water-scarce countries, all of those trends are getting worse, and all of those are very serious.
When you look, I'm staying on the dark side for a moment. We'll get to the hopeful part in a second. When you look at a book like Jared Diamond's Collapse, and you see that numbers of civilizations or cultures have collapsed almost always because there's an environmental factor. It may not be the only factor, but it's a big one. What I am imagining that's different now is that's all over the planet, not just this island or this culture. Is that a fair assessment?
I think so. This is really a unique moment in human history, and all of us who are alive today, I think, can be both alarmed and excited at the possibilities for really creating new civilizations. But really the scale of the problems, as you've indicated, is larger than anything that human beings have ever had to deal with.
Go ahead.
I was just going to add that you mentioned collapsing civilizations, and often it was the case in many of those civilizations that people didn't really understand what was happening to them. You know, on Easter Island, people were cutting down forests and losing a vital resource, and didn't understand until it was too late what they were doing to the very foundation of their economy. We have the capacity to understand, and we have the information. The question is, are we really going to pay attention and then act?
Which is critical. I mean, one of the things that's happened since you've been at Worldwatch, of course, is the rise of the internet, the World Wide Web, so that we're being able to pass information much more quickly from all sorts of sources, which is the good news. But that's only useful if we get to the side of can we act, will we act, as you said.
Right.
Now you're hopeful, you're saying more people, I mean certainly the polls say more Americans are saying they want to take care of the environment. That's good, we're on the right track. When you get to that, the will to act here, it would seem to me that we're going to need governments in taking action here, not just grassroots.
Absolutely.
Is that hopeful, or what are you seeing on that side?
Well, unfortunately, I mean, we can focus on the present federal government that unfortunately is not only not doing enough, but actually taking steps that send us backwards. On the other hand, you know, I really try to find the silver linings here. At the state level, we're finding all sorts of wonderful initiatives. I mean, the American people seem to be, through their state and local governments, acting in a way that the federal government has not, so that we see in the state of New York and in California, we're seeing attempts to cap carbon or attempts to set a minimum for the amount of electricity that comes from renewable energy. All of those are very hopeful signs and suggest to me that people are beginning to understand the gravity of the problem.
Of course, part of why groups like the Alliance for a Post-Petroleum Local Economy and others that are working at the local level is because that's where we can have more influence. And it's our neighborhood, it's our locale, we want it to be working. It's heartening to be in California because I know we're ahead of a lot of states in terms of our solar initiatives and looking at renewables and waste management and so on. So I just hope it just spreads. I mean, when we look at the scale of the problem, I think, Will it be enough?
Well, it's almost a race, isn't it, between the level of activity and awakening that I think we're seeing in society on the one hand, and then the worsening trends on the other. And it's almost like, are we acting quickly enough? Are we going to be able to really stave off some of the worst disasters?
Is there a way we can know that? Is there a way we have any clue whether we could, what we do now? I mean, can we do scenarios that what we do now will stave it off? For example, climate change, are there enough factors that we don't know about that it could just switch?
There are many unknowns in climate change, and things could switch for the worse very quickly. So there's much that we don't know, much we need to learn. And I think if we're going to act responsibly and in a precautionary way, we need to be assuming that some of the scenarios that scientists are laying out for us really could come true. And the other piece to this is we can just look at what is already happening. And you look around the world and you see the North and South poles are melting. We had a ship cross the Arctic Ocean a few summers ago. That was a big deal because they hadn't seen open water there for quite a long time, as perhaps a harbinger of what the Arctic Ocean will look like in the future. We see Bangladesh in 2004, I believe it was, had torrential rains. 2/3 of that country was underwater that summer because they're such a low-lying country, and for that reason they have reason to be very concerned about rising sea levels. You can look in Europe a couple of summers ago when 10,000 people died because of rising temperatures. It was an especially hot summer there, and the elderly really were not in a position to deal with that. 10,000 people died. I think we just need to look at what's happening around us, I think, to get a sense that we need to act.
It's happening, it feels like it's happening more quickly, more frequently, more severely. Certainly, of course, Hurricane Katrina and Rita brought that slamming home for us here in America. But that's not been the only thing that we've been experiencing. What else is happening just in our own North American area?
Well, there have been great floods in the Midwest in the early 90s. Of course, none of these individual weather events can definitively be blamed on climate change, but they're part of a pattern that is consistent with what climate models predict. Other things that are happening, you can look at the beetles, the pine beetles that live in the Rocky Mountains that have been migrating north into Canada where they don't have natural enemies. Well, they are decimating whole forests in Canada. That's happening now. It's happening to such a degree that loggers are going in and cutting down the remaining forest so they can get the wood before the beetles do. And sawmills are running 24 hours a day there.
And so here we're taking those wonderful trees that are sequestering carbon, which slows down the warming effect, because the beetles are going to get them.
Right.
I mean,
right.
everything is so woven together.
It really is. And when we're talking about climate change, we're talking about a whole web of issues that are being affected. I mean, you can talk about rising temperatures, of course, and rising sea level, more intense storms. We can talk about species like these beetles that are adapting to new habitat. We can talk about spreading disease, where mosquitoes can live in places that they couldn't in the past. And mosquitoes, of course, bear malaria in many cases. So there's a whole host of issues that are associated with climate change.
And so, of course, is part of your research suggestive of what can we do?
Absolutely, absolutely. We try to focus at least as much on solutions as we do on the problem. And there are many things that people can do, of course, in their own daily lives. The principal cause of carbon emissions into the atmosphere is from fossil fuels. So anything we can do to reduce our use of fossil fuels is to the good. And that can be driving a more gas-efficient car, not driving at all, if that makes sense in an individual's case. Buying local food, for example. I mean, does it make a lot of sense for us to be purchasing food that comes literally thousands and thousands of miles away overseas, fruit from Chile, for example? we can be looking at our own consumption habits and sort of figuring out where do fossil fuels figure into the way that I live and how might I reduce those.
But of course, it's just about everything we touch, right?
It is.
Because here in California, much of our power is generated by natural gas, which isn't as bad as maybe as oil or coal, but it's still generating greenhouse gases. So even turning the lights off and using less electricity or fewer, the phantom loads that we have in our stereos and our TVs and so on, I mean, just using electricity when they're turned off. I would imagine that, I mean, people that are going to be diligent about that, I imagine, can really reduce their footprint, their fossil fuel footprint. But it takes paying attention to a lot of factors.
It does, but I would say it can be fun too. It can really be fun to sort of redesign your life in a way that really has a much lower footprint on the earth. And there are people who have, net zero energy homes. People who've set up their home in such a way that they can produce their own power and then through more economical living don't need as much power as they might have in the past. People who run zero waste homes, essentially, where they compost a lot of their waste and recycle, and then have a very little amount, a very small amount that actually goes to the landfill.
So you're making connections here, because you think somebody might not be thinking about the fact that they don't recycle, or that they do, is affecting the climate.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's you have to make those connections.
Absolutely.
Of all sorts. Go ahead.
Another connection that I think people often are not aware of is that after carbon, the next gas that we worry about the most is methane, because molecule for molecule, it's very powerful in terms of its global warming potential. Well, methane comes from several sources, but from landfills. So the more organic material we are throwing into our garbage can and then into landfills, the more methane that gets produced.
And does that not happen if you compost it?
If you compost it and if you provide the aeration that it needs, then yes, you can avoid the methane emissions.
That's a major, hello, let's take probably our landfills could be sizably reduced, both if we were reusing some of the materials that we can reuse or take them apart and reuse them, but also we should be composting everything then, all of our kitchen scraps and so on.
To the credit, I think, of many local governments and I think the state of California as well, they've set goals for reducing the amount of green material, organic material that goes into waste flows. So there are efforts, I think, to get us to sort of take care of that material at home and compost it, prepare it in a way that it can serve us again next spring.
You just gave me an idea. We need to have community compost places, right? So you can bring some way to encourage people, if they don't have a place to do it or don't want to do it, to have, it's just as we have community gardens starting, to have the community compost bins, and you just bring your kitchen slop and people can bring the manure from their animals and we can mix it.
I moved here from Arlington, Virginia, where the city there will collect leaves that fall in the fall and compost them and then make the compost available for free in the spring to any city resident. So that was the way it was done on a city level. And of course, as you've indicated, you can do it on an individual level as well.
And a neighborhood level. Our county does have a mulching program for wood-based products to just break it back down into mulch. So we're doing that.
Great.
And as part of our fire safe efforts, people who are clearing for defensible space along their roads and around their homes can have it chipped. I also am aware that, this is a question to ask you, is a methane digester is a device, I don't know a lot about it, that can break down. Now, does it emit methane, or does it create contained methane that won't, how does it work? Which isn't maybe your area of expertise. But.
It's not my area of expertise, but my understanding of it is that it is capturing methane that you can then use. You can use as an energy source. And I should say also, in fairness to landfills, that some landfills do try to capture the methane that would be emitted and use that as an energy source.
So at every edge, we've got something we could be doing, whether it's conserving, whether it's more efficient, and I expect new technologies as well are available. So part of what I I'm imagining Worldwatch is saying, here are opportunities.
Absolutely.
Are you getting any hearing beyond, how do I say this? In countries other than the United States, and obviously we're the biggest polluter, the biggest contributor to global warming and many other aspects of those declines, but elsewhere in the world, are you finding that you're getting some hearing?
Yes, actually more than we get in the United States typically. Worldwatch is pretty well known in Scandinavia and in Japan, and our publications are published in 25 languages around the world. So we do have a presence overseas. We're not, interestingly, as well known in the United States, but we're working on it.
That's great, and it looks to me that Scandinavia is listening to you, since they Sweden declared that they plan to be at least fossil fuel free or close to that. Soon.
Right. In Scandinavia, they do wonderful things. Sometimes I say when I grow up, I want to be Swedish, or I want to be Norwegian or whatever, because they really do some wonderful, wonderful projects. And in Stockholm this year, they've started a new experiment where they are charging a fee to every car that goes into the city center as a way to reduce the number of cars and the congestion, and also to get people into public transit. And it's worked wonderfully well.
Do you find, one of the things that I've wondered about is sort of the attitude of a people, of a culture, to that kind of regulation, if you will. I have found myself wondering, I remember in the 1973-74 when we had the oil embargo and we reduced the speed limits to 55, and people pretty well stayed under 60 at least on the freeways, and we did that for a long while. I'm wondering, we're now in an era where road rage happens. Have you any sense of how Americans would respond to voluntarily or having to limit usages? Do you have a feel for that?
Well, I think it's difficult for us in part because it's not just a personal question, it's an infrastructure question as well. And so if you don't have the option, if you don't have access to good, accessible, affordable public transportation, then it makes it difficult to give up the car. But I also know that there is tremendous slack in the way that we live as Americans, and tremendous possibility for changing our lifestyle without it hurting, really. There's a great story from Los Angeles after the first oil crisis in 1973, when the city was quite concerned that it was not going to get the oil that it had ordered from the Middle East. And so they set up a plan where they were going to reduce energy use by, I think it was something like 13%. And they had a whole structure of penalties that they were going to put into place for people who did not comply. They left it up to every individual and every business to determine how they would meet that goal. And in the end, they cut energy use by 18%. They exceeded the goal, and they didn't have to charge a single fine. They didn't have to levy a single fine.
There's a real important piece of that, I think it is. I think that if people had a sense that we are all in this together, our whole community we're all going to need to conserve, say, 5% a year, every year, 3%, 5% less energy use. If we knew we were all doing it, I imagine that we could be rallying together to see, what did you do? What do you find that works? That kind of camaraderie.
Sure.
That is possible.
I think that's part of it, although I wonder if that only sustains us in times of crisis.
It has to be some shared, there's some rules there.
Yeah, but I think there's also a need to emphasize the positive side to some of these reductions in energy use or resource use, whatever it may be. The potential for living a freer life, for having more time, for just being less encumbered, I think, in our lives. Once people sort of get that message and really believe it, then I think we can see some real changes.
And that's maybe where we'll have people that are models for us, begin to see our neighbors not as frantic, not as rushed, doing things like the carpool. Actually, we have about 3 minutes left here. I have a neighbor who, just by having someone else take 2 of her children to school, worked out a carpool. I just watched the stress level go down for her to not have to be dealing with all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the kind of thing that you're thinking of that kind of make our lives easier in a way?
Exactly. You know, and I'm new to Grass Valley, this area. I've been here less than a year, and I've been pleasantly surprised to find co-housing communities in Nevada City and in Grass Valley. And I think there are some real lessons to learn there, that when we sort of share our lives together, we can really reduce the level of stress. I mean, you know, one way that we try to save time, for example, in cooking, is buying a lot of processed foods, okay? And on the surface, that seems like a logical strategy.
Sure.
On the other hand, in many co-housing communities, people will cook a meal for the entire community, and they take turns doing that cooking. So you might have to cook, you know, a couple of times a month, but you get to eat with the community, you know, without any work several times a month. And you actually end up, I believe, saving more time through that cooperative strategy than through...
Not just time, but look at the other side. You get to have the conviviality of you didn't have to make dinner a whole lot of those nights, and you can share it with your neighbors, and you can swap recipes. And so what we do is we're reweaving the bonds of community again, which the automobile allowed us to be mobile. I mean, that was the positive side, but the downside is it's very isolating, very alienating.
Exactly.
Welcome to our community. We are
Well, thank
very
you.
honored
It's
to
great to
have
be here.
you here.
Thank you.
What, in our last minute here, any last thoughts we knew we wanted to cover that we didn't?
I think I would want to stress something about climate change, and that is that the problem is being experienced to the greatest degree by people who did the least to create the problem. I'm thinking, for example, of a village in Tuvalu in the South Pacific, a nation there, a very small nation. Last summer, the United Nations announced that one of the villages on the coast there was being moved 500 meters inland because of rising sea levels, increasing storms. People were not able to have their community on that coast any longer. They did very little, virtually nothing to create this problem. And I think we need to think about that as we think about our response.
That's the bit of compassion, is to realize we're creating a lot of the problem, but a lot of other people are having the suffering. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Big picture and that heartful picture. Join us again for the next episode of Peak Moment.